Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to Tortoise, welcome here. There are some people who are old friends who have come in this evening that we haven't seen since before the pandemic, so it's lovely to have you back. There are people who I know I haven't met before, and obviously there are people watching from home as well. Thanks very much for being with us. My name is Liz Moseley, I'm one of the editors here. And we're going to try and do what we have been sort of calling a proper think-in. And for those of you like Tina who have been to think-ins in days of yore, the idea of a think-in is that we listen, first of all. Obviously the Queen passed away on Thursday last week, and we here in the Tortoise newsroom, a slow newsroom I know, but still a newsroom, we obviously had to get together to figure out what that meant for us, what we did with our planned coverage, how to respond in terms of activity that we were going to do this week if it was or wasn't appropriate, and also how we make the most of the idea of Tortoise, what makes a difference, which is we have all of you, the members and the team actually. There's quite a lot of Team Tortoise here this evening to sort of chew over, think through, reflect on this thing that happened. We knew it was coming, and sort of in a very practical sense, and James, obviously, you'll know, our co-founder, used to be the director of BBC News, was part of the planning of all of that stuff. The phrase, you know, for my career anyway, when the Queen dies, it was almost a sort of shorthand that we used to say for all of these things will happen unless something else happens that supersedes them. And now we have to come up with a different set of terminology for that, for planning for the unexpected, I suppose. So I have no agenda tonight, and you'll notice that there's nobody sitting up here. And normally at a think-in, we have what we call invited experts or speakers who come to sort of frame and share their expertise and their points of view and to get us going. And that we've deliberately not done that for this conversation today, because everybody is on a level playing field with this conversation, and we really are only here to chew over how you feel today, Tuesday, how you have felt, things you've done, perhaps things that have surprised you, things that you think are important, valuable, or just a thing to share, really. I have a totally neutral agenda for the conversation. And so I guess my first port of call, I'm going to go to Oliver. I've just met Oliver. Hi, Oliver. This happens when you come to Tortoise. And Oliver, this is your first time you've been in, so I'm sorry, it is slightly a baptism of fire.
Okay. I'm Oliver, by the way.
And you've told me a really interesting story about what you did on Thursday. Just replay that, because I think it's an interesting starting point.
Yes, and I think I've sort of absorbed quite a lot of the BBC News over the last sort of few days, but I was sort of live streaming the headlines on my phone on the DLR on the way to go to dinner with my brother and sister-in-law. And, you know, Hugh Edwards comes on, the screen goes black, people crowded around me on the DLR, and, you know, I sort of announced it to the entire tube carriage that Her Majesty the Queen had died. So I'm, sort of trying to get a job at the BBC, but I sort of I reflected on this sort of, you know, magnificent and huge event that had happened, and I was, you know, on my way to go for dinner with my brother and sister-in-law, and, you know, to Greenwich. I got there and I couldn't sit down, I couldn't have dinner, and I sort of had to apologise to them, and I sort of felt really compelled to go to Buckingham Palace that evening, and, you know, I was almost sort of asking for their permission that I could go and leave them and sort of disappoint them. It's not often that they come to London to visit me, but also not often that, you know, our monarch of such a long time has died. So, you know, I sort of quickly left to go to Buckingham Palace, and before all the sort of barriers were erected, you know, it was a very heartfelt kind of atmosphere that people had sort of congregated within half an hour of hearing the news. And the atmosphere, I thought, it was a very somber atmosphere, a very calm atmosphere. People sort of spontaneously breaking into applause and singing "God Save the King." And I thought that's something that will certainly, a memory that will live with me for a very long time, I think.
Oliver, do you, a couple of things, they might be strange questions, but I feel like this is what we're here for.
Yeah.
First, can you remember exactly the words you said on the DLR when you told the carriage that it had happened? Can you remember what you actually said?
Well, I think it was, just the Queen has passed, and I thought that was quite an emotional time as well. And we were sort of talking here a moment ago about in London people don't always sort of talk to you, and it can be quite a sort of lonely place sometimes. And so for suddenly a sort of audience of people around, and sort of wishing me well as well, because there are lots of tourists on the DLR and people that sort of here looking in, not actually sort of feeling what I was feeling. And for me to actually feel genuine emotion was something I didn't necessarily expect.
I was going to say, of the people who know you, and maybe you know you, are you surprised that that was what happened, how it played out? Or will people be like, oh, Oliver's such a monarchist, he's bound to, be up there like a shot kind of thing?
I think the latter there, yeah. I think I was surprised. I think other people may not have been. But, I think the history of the monarchy, I think, is something that is so interesting to me. And I'm not a historian in any sense, but I just feel that what we've witnessed is such a historic occasion, and I wanted to be part of that. And I think that's also where the emotion comes from, and the gratitude of someone who has completely selflessly devoted their entire lives to our nation, I think.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Who else has been down to Buckingham Palace, Green Park, or similar? James has been, Mark has been. Interesting. Tina, let's hear from you. This is Tina, who's the person I said who I haven't seen with your body since the last time you were here was the night of the general election.
Yes,
right.
Which was in the old office.
In the old office. So you've been down?
Yes, I went Friday around lunchtime.
And how are you feeling now?
Well, actually, I was in the area, to be honest. I went to a meeting and then I drove past Hyde Park and there were all this police, and it sort of dawned on me that I'm just there. So I just, had some time, and I thought, actually, I really, really want to go. So I parked up and went. And I find it really soothing. It's this sort of collective grief, I suppose, this collective, everybody's talking to each other. And actually, because as I left, or just before I left, sort of King Charles and Camilla arrived, and anyway, so when I was going back to my car, there were these two elderly ladies, and they were sort of talking to me, saying, we were in the first row, and King Charles, we sort of shook hands, and I said to Camilla, you look after him, you look after him, and Camilla said, I'll try my best, and I knew that just would make their day or their year or whatever, and I found that really touching. So I do it for myself, and I do it also, I wanted to pay respects, but it really helps me. So now I'm feeling okay. I think that was important for me to do. I was quite tearful on Friday.
Were you? I was as well.
Yeah, I was.
Actually, Thursday I was tearful. Friday I was okay again.
Oh no, I was tearful on Friday, and I was very moved by King Charles's speech. That sort of said.
You?
Yeah, I was very, very, very moved by it. I thought it was
emotive. That's really interesting, because it left me a cold, the speech.
So interesting, yeah. Really,
yeah.
Did it? I mean, he must have. I think he wrote it, years ago, and I think that really came. I thought it was perfectly pitched. I looked at it also analytically. But I felt the emotion, and. I kind of felt, what, we'll be okay. That's how I felt.
Interesting. Here's some other reactions to King Charles's address to the nation. I'll tell you why it left me a little bit cold. I wanted him to be I was watching it thinking, okay, the man's just lost his mother, and now he's in this awful moment, really awful as on a human level, and he has to deliver this speech and he has to keep it together. I just wanted him to be just a little bit more human, just a little tiny bit more human, but I couldn't get that. Hello, so what's your name?
I'm David.
Hi, David.
Yeah, I mean...
Are you a butler?
I am a butler.
Oh, I can tell from the voice.
Yeah.
I can tell from the
I
voice.
was just telling Tommy that. Yeah, I was...
Not literally a butler.
To clarify. Those who aren't aware, there are three of us.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, David, go on.
That's quite right. Yeah, no, I think it was a case of... it was helpful that we were told it was pre-recorded, that it wasn't a live thing. So I thought the emotion could have been taken out of that aspect. I thought he was quite emotional with it, but it was more just like making sure like every area that is a concern. So Church of England is one of the was one of the concerns, and then Harry and Meghan especially. I thought his line about them was just really simple and like clearly just a dad and his son. And then the other thing was, as soon as he said, I'm passionate about climate change and that kind of thing, and he said about that as a king he can't do his kind of passions and interests, and then immediately basically gave William free rein to go with whatever William is interested in, which is the Earthshot Prize and all of those passions that he's got. So I was very relieved, because I think William is a better communicator as well than Charles. So on that aspect I was just hopeful actually after that speech. Yeah.
Interesting, hopeful. I've got soothing, I've got gratitude, and I've got hopeful. The point, funny enough, about Oliver mentioned, and you did too, Tina, that people were talking to each other. The fact that we noticed that, because in general, certainly on the DLR, if someone talks to you, you kind of press the panic button a bit. You know what I mean? It is unusual that people would sort of open up, and that's a nice thing. Our James's co-founder, Katie, she always says, sometimes in job interviews, slightly weirdly, do you talk to people on the tube? And obviously people quite often go, no. And she wants you to say yes. Just a tip if you're ever trying to get a job here. George, you're holding the mic. Is that just because you're looking after it, or because you want to? Have you been down? No. Where is you? You are a Kiwi, an Aussie.
Aussie. Yeah.
Okay, so let's have an Aussie perspective then.
Oh no, Liz. I don't really have a perspective, to be honest. I don't have that much sadness, but I'm not politically not sad.
Have you talked to friends about it? When you see other people feeling sad, do you think, get over it, or what's all this to do with? Or
no, I did think get over it a little bit when the Australian government took 2 weeks off. I think that's a little bit of a come on, guys. But no, I don't
How's
think get
that
over
gone
it.
down in Australia?
There's been a lot of, can we focus on things closer to home?
Has there?
Yeah.
Fair point. Patricia's nodding. Let's hear from Patricia. Dangerous, you see, in the thinking. Hi,
Hello.
Patricia. This is my colleague. How do you feel about it all?
It's quite hard to articulate. I'm not very sad. So I'm a Republican, and I feel like, for me, I mean, I feel sad for her as an individual. She seemed like a nice person. I'm sorry she died. But when you detach the monarchy from the Queen, to me, it just brings out the ridiculousness of the whole system, and the fact that we're spending money on this, that we're, cancelling major events, to me just feels like it's part of a system that I don't believe should exist. And I know that, it's a tricky thing to say now, but actually I think that people say, oh, wait until the mourning is done before you express, a political opinion. And I don't think that's true at all. I think this is the moment where we should be reflecting on the place that monarchy has in this country. I also didn't grow up here, so I maybe also don't feel that kind of connection to the Queen as the nation's grandmother and all of that either. But just seeing notifications, King Charles is doing this, King Charles, I just felt sort of slightly frustrated
Yes.
and not very sad.
Thank you. That question about the thinking we're going to do tomorrow evening is specifically about Charles III and the monarchy and Britain and the sort of the chewier, spikier, I suppose, constitutional and sort of national identity kind of questions. But there is something about this time, and I was worried. I felt more anxious about this thinking than maybe I would another type of one and a different type of time, because I do have a sort of sense of, I'm not going to say self-censorship, but I want to tread carefully, and we're not used to that in newsrooms particularly, that sort of sense of responsibility. James, what do you think?
I thought a couple of things. So this is like a very tangential reflection, which was it was my dad's 80th birthday on the weekend, and one of his old friends showed up wearing a black tie, right, for the party. And he's a very particular, beloved man who used to work in the Foreign Office, and he said, you know, if you were in the Foreign Office, when you went through National Mourning, you would all wear a black tie. And I then thought to myself, oh, that's so interesting. Partly because there is, and I know we have the Bishop of Durham here, so I'm going to tread carefully too, but for him there was something which is, he's a Church of England person, but also for him, England, the United Kingdom, Britishness is a religion too. There's a kind of moment of marking in ritual what it means to be British, and he was doing that. And then I was thinking about this conversation that Matthew and I had had in the podcast studio on Friday, and over the weekend I thought, isn't it funny, but lots of the people here in this room and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people outside this room have probably met the Queen. And when I was in the room with Matthew, we did a bit of conversation about, had Matthew done the wrong thing because he had relayed a conversation that he'd had with the Queen, but actually he hadn't actually relayed it, someone had misinterpreted it, but there was this kind of angst in the embassy and in Buckingham Palace that he had said what the Queen had said. And then I thought, oh, you know, I met the Queen and I had a really interesting conversation. And in that podcast studio, I didn't say what she'd said, and I haven't said what she'd said. And the thing about it is, and I'll tell you what she'd said in a second, but what I was interested in was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't, like, Anna, you know me, like my deal is, I can't believe I just met someone, I can't believe what they just said, right? You really want to do that with the Queen, but we all somehow respect that convention that you don't report or relay conversations with the Queen. And it made me think in a kind of Noah Yuval Harari way, which is, you know, we are just the sum of our stories. It made me reflect on the fact that as much as she has been the making of the modern monarchy, we have also been the making of her.
Yes.
There is an extent to which we buy into the idea of the Queen and potentially King Charles III, and we make her by going along with those conventions, whether it's wearing a black tie or not relaying the conversation. As it happened, mine was she'd just come back from Ireland and she'd had a very nice time. But which at the time was quite a thing, given it was her visit. But that interests me, the extent to which the monarchy is not something that is done to us, that is something that we collectively contribute to make. And I actually think that Republican debate is part of that. If you can do it healthily, if you can do it honestly and vigorously, it shouldn't be the case that, you know, people who are monarchists thinks there shouldn't be room for Republicans. That's part of the opposite way around. So I was just interested in that, what we bought into.
It is interesting that she, her specifically, and the institution are created as much as they exist independently. Zav's got your hand up. It's my colleague Zav, also the catcher.
I mean, I found the last few days really weird because I'm not someone who's really ever thought about the Queen in any kind of, you know, emotional sense, or someone who has personally affected me in any way, or someone who I even think is particularly important in my own life. I found myself, sadder than I thought on Thursday. I kind of rooted that to, I think, this sense that a lot of us, have just always kind of internalized her as part of our state, part of our iconography. And I think in the hours leading up to the Queen's death, the BBC was talking a lot about the potential kind of disorientation people would feel.
Yeah.
And I think I felt some of that kind of disorientation. It just kind of felt weird to think, this person who we have just internalized as part of our fabric of the state has passed away. And that has slowly changed over the past few days. And really, for me, it's been, the abstraction of the Queen's death colliding with the reality of, as Patricia has put it, the way that we are, hearing about food banks closing on Monday and people not having operations and Parliament sitting for one day in the next month and a half. And it's been it's really hard to, I think, as the mourning period goes on, I'm finding it harder and harder to separate those two things. I think on the Thursday, it was really easy to have the kind of emotional, communal abstraction of the Queen has died and this is sad. And I think as time goes on, and it's part of the nature of as soon as the Queen dies, the process of installing King Charles starts. I understand the kind of constitutional convention for that, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. But I think a byproduct of that is that you're immediately into the, this is what we need to cancel, this is what needs to happen, this is what needs to happen. Almost if you had 4 days to reflect on the sadness of the Queen and everything stayed open and people could just mourn in their own ways, and then you got on with the constitutional stuff, that would almost work better than I think this, which is this weird middle ground where you can't quite think of her in this kind of abstract sense when all these practical things are coming at you.
There's another contrast. I went for lunch today with a Tortoise member who is in London. I've met him on Thinkings in the telly loads of times, but in person he came. We went for lunch. Called Chris Cregan, and he made this. I know, what a treat! And he made a really interesting but different contrast. The one you're talking about, Zav, is sort of here's the Queen story, and then here's food banks closing and all those other things. And he sort of was reflecting on. But the week before, Mikhail Gorbachev died, and that's a person who really deserved quite a fuss made of his funeral, and it was a couple of hundred people, and that was and I think that's another sort of interesting thing to reflect on. I'm not saying that the Queen didn't have an impact. She most certainly did, but there are different kinds of impacts. There's different kinds of lasting impacts. Go for it, Phoebe. How can we get a mic to Phoebe? Do you want this one? I think my one is working, so you can probably have that.
So I think that's really interesting, this idea of like the next few days. And I think because for people who don't know, there was this piece by Sam Knight in The Guardian on London Bridge, which was
London Bridge, as in Operation London Bridge.
Operation London Bridge.
The
plans,
media plans,
and the things, and the operations, and the marquee, and the feather, and the Springtide, and all these other names. So, and as someone in the media, I felt very part of that system. That was almost, I don't want to say exciting, but it is a moment as a reporter, and so that was kind of interesting. But one of the things in that is these kind of processes and days, and it's kind of D-Day, and I've been working with Giles, and we'll probably cover it in Sensemaker this week, but some of those things aren't as established as I kind of once thought. So lying in state, for example, which I kind of is obviously going to be kind of one of the biggest things this weekend in London. I think we're kind of expecting 750,000 people, and I would expect a lot of the coverage this weekend to be people in the queue, and I'm going to go myself and chat to people. That's only happened since 1910, and it was Edward VII who did it first. And I think it's those things of like imagery and what we kind of, and those kind of the byproduct is that we've almost made lying in state a thing by attending, and the reports at the time were that 500,000 people attended and 3 to 5 million came down to London. Can kind of expect similar numbers. And Edward VII was I can't believe I now know this and I now have all these facts about the monarchy, was only king for 9 years. So, you know, and then people still, and they came and they kind of walked past, and it's just been interesting to think about whether or not those things that we just take as written, the things that we do, and the yearly thing that I most associate with the Queen is the opening of Parliament, because it still has a lot of the flummery, I think is the word we've been using this week, that goes into it, and that's these kind of moments. But it's like, I think it's good to have a bit of a low Earth orbit, as Giles likes to call it, and go, okay, but how long have we actually had these kind of symbols? And that makes it maybe easier to think about how these few days pan out.
I think there's some really interesting stuff in there. I'd like to come to Vivian, and then I feel, because the Bishop of Durham is in our midst, and I know you've got jobs in this in the space. I feel I'm going to come to.
Yeah, of course.
So, Vivian, I'm interested to know. We talked briefly before we started. Yeah. Phoebe's talking about the sort of set piece behaviours. Some of them, it feels to me like we learned them when Diana died, that we go with our flowers and we put them by the gates, and they've become really sort of established modes. But you're a bereavement counsellor.
I am, and
so let's.
It's well known, it's well documented that every time somebody has a bereavement, they build that on top of earlier griefs, and so I always try to find out what the history of bereavement has been with the clients that I'm working with, because that gives an indication of where they're at. But actually, I want to say something else. I'm looking around the room. I think I'm the oldest person in the room. And I remember so well the Queen's coronation, and that we had a television. I remember the room that we were sitting in when we were watching. And I remember my parents, that's James's grandparents, emotions, because they had only recently arrived in the UK from Germany, where they had fled. Fortunately, most of our family got out. And we were brought up very, very strongly to love the institution of the monarchy, to be grateful to it, to be grateful to the country. And my mother, that's James's grandmother, became a London tourist guide, because she wanted to show her German, couldn't believe it myself, her German tourists visiting the UK, what a wonderful country it is, and spoke so warmly always about the Queen and the monarchy. And I feel a real connection with the family now, and what we have gone through as a family, as immigrants, as refugees, as survivors, and so grateful to the Queen and the royal family and the whole country for accepting us and allowing us to flourish.
Vivian, thank you. You use the word connection to the country and the monarchy. And the loss of the Queen, you said before we started, you still feel very sad.
I do feel sad. I do feel sad, and I knew for a long time that I was going to feel sad. And it's very difficult, it's actually impossible to prepare yourself for a bereavement. And you think when you get there that you know what's going to happen, and you don't. And I was actually staying with some friends in France. We were watching the news. It was 7:30 in France, 6:30 here, when the news came up, and there was Hugh Edwards. And I just burst into tears, and I sobbed. I really sobbed, and I feel very emotional even now.
Thank you, Vivian. Lovely to hear from you. Auntie Vivian, I feel like I'm going to call you.
Correct.
Everybody's Auntie Vivian. It's
very special.
Brave silence for the Bishop. Forgive me, I don't know your real name. I'm so sorry. Paul, there we go. Hi, Paul.
I obviously come at it because I'm part of the establishment. So I'm inside the establishment, but perhaps you need a bit of history. I never, ever expected to be part of this system. I didn't grow up in a church-going family or anything. So I've found my way into the establishment unexpectedly. But once you become a bishop, and particularly when you become one of the 5 front bench bishops, which the Bishop of Durham is, you become very embedded in the establishment. So, you know, I met the late Majesty the Queen on a number of occasions, including one-to-one conversations with her. So, in that sense, inevitably, I suppose, personally, I remember those things, which is why I feel sad, because she was just a wonderful human being to meet. She, you almost forgot that she was the Queen. So I haven't shared this story publicly before, but this is a story rather than something she said. At Sandringham, you get invited as a bishop to go to Sandringham. You're a working member of the household. You have to preach on the Sunday morning. And all the guests who are there for the weekend, they go at after lunch, but the bishop stays. Oh. So on the Sunday evening, all dressed up, because that was what I was told I had to do, and Her Majesty all dressed up, and Prince Philip, I found myself around a table with just 5 of us, the Queen, Prince Philip, an equerry, a lady-in-waiting, and me. And I'm sitting there pinching myself thinking, how on earth did this little boy from Chessington find himself here? And we chatted, and I'm not going to tell you what we chatted about. But she said to me at the end of the meal, she said, Bishop, I hope you don't mind, but one of my horses is running in New York tonight, and one of the kind footmen has set up the satellite TV so that we can watch it. Would you join me? No. So we went into this small lounge, and I went to go to a seat, and there was a settee about, it's a 2-person settee, rather than the 3, like the one in front of me. And I went to another seat, and she said, no, come and sit here. So I'm sat absolutely next to her watching a horse race in New York. Now, this isn't giving away secrets because we've seen her on the screens at Epsom and at Ascot screaming her horses on. Well, I can tell you that she was mild-mannered publicly compared with what I saw. And she stood up and screamed this horse home. It got beaten by a head on the line, and she was so cross. So I remember a human person who it was my privilege to have met in a way that most people don't get. But also someone who I reckon, I think, and this is really more tomorrow night, she has given this nation a stability that it's very hard for us to recognise and understand. But you have to understand the history, which Viv has just shared. That's part of it. It's what she did as a teenager in the war. It's how she came to the throne. And the country was still in rationing and all that. And we were still an empire. She created the Commonwealth. She did more to create the Commonwealth than any other individual on earth, because she realised empire was gone, but she saw something different. And that's why I think there are all sorts of questions about what does the future look like, except that I think, I'm allowed to, I think that the fact that Prince Charles has been waiting for so long may well be in our nation's favour and in his favour. Yeah. I think he has learned, he's had the opportunity to be the individual speaking up on environmental issues and so on. So we all know. We never really knew what the Queen thought about anything because she was so young. We do know that Charles thinks that some things are very important. So we know that when William speaks up on those, that he will have the backing of the King. So I think we are entering a new era, and what it will look like will be very different. I was kind of, I suppose in my growing up, ambivalent about monarchy. That's what we've got. Unlike you, I'm afraid, I've become a great fan of the monarchy because I've looked at republicanism and I don't think it offers the stability for a nation that we have. And actually, if a president of the United States did die, they would spend just as much money on funerals and things like that as we are. Republics don't come cheap.
They just don't do it as well.
They just don't do it as well. And it was, sorry, I've wrapped it on. Tomorrow afternoon, I have the honour of being one of the 6 bishops who will be in there receiving the coffin into Westminster Hall. That's one of the odd things about being part of the establishment.
Yeah.
That's certainly one of the things I never thought I would do in my life.
Yeah, extraordinary. Well, I hope it goes well. Do you feel nervous about it?
To be honest, no. Because I know it's been so well thought through and it will all happen. And I will be told exactly where to stand and when, and I will stand stock still because we do this stuff remarkably well.
Yeah, we are good at this. I think so. Yeah. Soldiers, horses, we're there. Matt's got his hand up, and I know there are people who want to join in online, so I'm going to come to Nico MacDonald in a second. Hi, Matt.
Hi. Wow, we'll follow that. I think there are so many things one could say about the last few days, but one of the things that's been sort of coursing through my mind a lot is how it's shown our complete... We've forgotten the talent of thinking historically. We've lost it. You know, I think I'm paraphrasing Edmund Burke, but it's something like society is a contract between past, present and future. We don't think that anymore, for reasons that aren't necessarily culpable, because I think living in the present day with the bombardment we had with digital technology and so on, the present is like an impacted nerve. It's constantly being charged up, and it's hard to devote thought to the past or the future, which is a big problem because, for a start, all the big things facing us now are huge long-term problems. Pandemics, climate change, longevity, social care, proper public service reform is just based on the political cycle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a real issue. And I think that a lot of what you've seen in the last sort of few days is a kind of cognitive dissonance, which is people thinking, bloody hell, there's this whole history thing. Now, in the last few years, the way we've tended to deal with history is to treat it as something to be ignored apart from two extremes, which is either to, in the kind of UKIP way, as a kind of made-up nostalgia, UKIP, retro, horror, monocultural land, which never existed. And the other is a place to be reviled and scorned and apologised for as intrinsically a bad thing. Everything about the past was bad. Everything started in 2012, or thereabouts. And elsewhere I've written, I've called this thin earth thinking, not flat earth thinking, but thin earth thinking, which is that we walk now on a very thin crust. We assume that you don't need to think about anything deep below you, because we've got all the answers and we walk on this thin crust and we're right about everything. So we don't talk about service anymore. There's been a lot of talk about service since the Queen died, but actually, if I'm honest, I don't think most people know what it means. They know what they think virtue is, being right about everything, and they know what victimhood is, suffering as a consequence of things. But I don't think people actually have a clear idea of service anymore, with notable exceptions. Obviously, one thinks of the NHS staff during the pandemic. And so I think that this is a massive Monty Python foot on top of us, actually. And my hope is, and I think de Bishop was absolutely spot on. I used to think that Charles's age was going to be a problem. But I now think that it's his best asset, because the image we had of him was of this sort of slightly captious, spoilt, sulky, single issue, plant-talking young man who was the only man in London who wasn't in love with Diana, which was
capricious.
Which is, and in the middle of that, we forgot that he's bloody 73 now, and so on the telly on Friday night appeared not this kind of grumpy 40-year-old driving cars off to see Mrs. Parker Bowles in the countryside, but a twinkly old grandad who's had the longest job interview and Twitter feed history on the surface of the planet. And I thought he was generous about Meghan and Harry, which is not to say that job is done. I thought he made it very clear he's not going to be an activist monarch, which is not to say that he won't have, fall off the wagon from time to time. But considering where we might have been, it's not a bad start. So my sort of my my caption line is "Welcome back to history." Whether people welcome that, I don't know, because one of the things of the technological revolution has been the certainty that we are right about everything, and that precedent and things like books and awful, boring stuff like that have anything to offer anyone has kind of gone out the window for a bit. And that part of me, which is seriously traditionalist, hopes a little bit of it comes back, but we'll see.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Matt. Matt wrote the obituary of the Queen for Tortoise, and it is well worth 8 minutes of your time to read. I'd love to hear from Nico MacDonald watching from home, and if Alexandra Willis is able to come on, I'd love to hear from you. Hi, Nico.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. What do you make of all this?
Well, as I wrote in the chat, I'm politically a Republican, and I've even sold an issue of Living Marxism magazine with "Abolish the Monarchy" on the cover, probably in about 1989, as an attempt to promote republicanism. But I have to say, my response to the Queen's death was, saying positive is the wrong way of putting it, was to celebrate a life well lived. I think it's hard to think of a more wonderful individual, of course, with all the privileges and chances in life and so on, but someone who has, Matt was saying, understood what service was and carried it out without complaining, without stalling, without faltering in any way. And I think it's an amazing life. I mean, it sounds really trite, but you can almost compare it to a kind of a living artwork like Gilbert and George or David Bowie in some ways. It's hard to think of anyone whose life reflected something so totally as the Queen's did. And I think that's a lesson for us in how to be human, how to live. And I think we need to take that lesson. And I think there's been quite a lot of bad faith about the monarch being privileged, outdated, unnecessary. And I think those are arguments to be had, but I think to be had at another time. Because I think if you can't celebrate the human spirit and human flourishing, what do you want? What do you stand for politically if you can't recognize that thing in a human being, and in fact want everyone to have those opportunities and the ability to flourish in that way? On the other hand, lots of people have protested against Andrew, against Charles, and so on, and been threatened with arrest and so on. And I wouldn't do that now. I don't think it's the time. I don't think it's appropriate. I think some grace is needed. But people who have been very quiet about freedom of speech and protest around people who protest against lockdown, against imposition on women's rights, of the trans activism debate, and so on, threats to J.K. Rowling, have been very vocal about freedom of speech when it's something that they support, which is republicanism. And I think there's a sort of, a certain hypocrisy there. But I'm very much with the Bishop of Durham, at least on the issue of the Queen being a wonderful human being. Bishop, I'm very much against you on thinking that Charles is a good thing because he's an environmentalist. Politics and the monarchy don't mix. We made that compact in 1689. And if the monarchy doesn't keep it, then this is a very inappropriate phrase, but putting another nail in its own coffin. So I think we need to recognize environmentalism as a political movement, and the monarchy, because we are the citizens in charge, and Parliament is in charge, and the Crown's in Parliament, cannot be political for its own good.
Thanks, Nico. We'll definitely have a good swing at the environmentalism, politics, and the monarchy tomorrow night, I would think, when we take a closer look at Charles. Funnily enough, I haven't read all the coverage, and actually a lot of the coverage is sort of, I can't quite bring myself to, in all honesty. But there's the prevailing wisdom of Charles's age, as Paul and Matt said, being a negative. I really felt when I saw his face on the screen when he was sitting there, he's so familiar that I really didn't think anything other than, oh yeah, there he is. It was really not as discombobulating as when Hugh Edwards said, I'm sorry to report the Queen is announced, the King is making his way. And that was the moment when I sort of thought, hang on a minute, I'm not ready for that. But then when I saw him there, I just thought, oh, hiya. You know, I'm sort of familiar with you, all good. If Alexandra is there, I don't know, Phoebe, is Alexandra around?
She might be. She's on her iPhone. If not, I can read out what she sent over, because I think it's.
If you're on the hoof, Alexandra, don't worry. I don't want you to feel that you're sort of unable to. Maybe she can't. Go on, Phoebe. I thought it was interesting about what she was saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Alexandra, who sent me a message, just said that she was actually in Kiev on Thursday when she heard the news. So in Ukraine, and that she was already kind of struck by the reaction to being British in Ukraine, a lot of support, especially to support for the fight. And then once the Queen died, she was kind of inundated with people wanting to express condolences. The British Embassy, there was already kind of a bouquet of flowers, and she went and laid some flowers there as well, and all sorts of sweet notes. So I think that kind of international point is really interesting to see how that is in comparison to Australia. I think other countries like Brazil had 3 days of national mourning, and I know Bolsonaro is coming to the funeral, and I think that's been quite interesting to see. And those who watched the Emmys last night saw there was kind of an odd reaction to comments about Charles at that point as well. So I think the difference, I guess, between now and 1910 is that we're a lot more global, and you can kind of see the reaction in New Zealand from Jacinda Ardern kind of being woken up in the middle of the night to going to Hyde Park and chatting to people outside the gates. So, that was a quite interesting comment, I think.
Thank you very much. Don't be shy in the room if you want to join in, stick your hand up, because we're into the last sort of 10 minutes or so. Mark, I just noticed at the beginning, you said you'd been down to the Mall or somewhere. I'm surprised that you went. When did you go, and what did you make of it?
I went on Friday afternoon, mid-afternoon. Why are you surprised?
I don't know why I'm surprised. I just would have thought you'd walk the other way.
Yeah, no. So I am sort of a bit of a closet monarchist, but maybe not so closet, because my father was in the army before I was born, and so I was dragged to the Royal Tournament every year to see all that kind of stuff. So I buy into what you say about soldiers and horses. I get really quite welled up when I see it. So because I pretty much can be relied on to cry, I don't go to anything like that, because I will cry in public. But I'm totally sold on the magic of it, the rainbows over Windsor Castle, the photo today of the shaft of sunlight that hit the coffin in Edinburgh or Belfast, I think. I don't know if you've seen that. Yeah, I can feel myself kind of choking up now on it. It's,
Really?
yeah. I'm sort of not sad, but I am incredibly moved by the events that are going on around it, if that makes sense.
So the feeling was that when you went, you wanted to be there to participate, to experience?
Yeah, kind of. It was John the Vegan wanted to go because he wanted to feel
John the
part
Vegan's
of it.
Mark's boyfriend, for the uninitiated, but most people know who that is.
Yeah. So he was like, I really want to go. I don't want to feel like I miss out on this moment in history. I think we should go down. I was like, yeah, okay, let's go down. And I think we probably saw we saw it at the last opportunity where I think it would be a pleasant experience.
Right.
It was very busy. All the TV crews were there. There was some quite mad gifts and things being handed over the railings to be put on the front of Buckingham Palace. We wanted to see the sign basically at the front so that we could tell people in 20 years' time that we'd seen the proclamation at the palace gates.
Yeah.
I did think that when the coffin came to Westminster Hall, because I live just over Westminster Bridge, I could set my alarm for 1 a.m, nip over and have a quick look. That's clearly not going to happen, and I'm not fussed about.
Quick look is what
you
can do.
So I'm not. I don't feel like a need to go and file past the coffin because I'm not going to queue for 15 hours or, all of that.
Is anybody going to go?
To do which what?
To join the line and walk past the coffin? No.
I'll queue with you for a bit.
Yes, but we have to make cheat.
You've got Disney queue jumpers. I know you have. I know you have. Get them on eBay. James.
Can I just go back, just for one second, can I just go back to the thing that Matt said? I can't work out what to think, Matt, about what you just said around. It's such a smart point about virtue and victimhood and the sort of UKIP versus the Edward Colston kind of view of history. I completely understand that. But I suppose what I'm struggling with a bit in the death of the Queen is the extent to which we use history and stability and her as a camouflage of where we are, and that history somehow makes us feel secure when we're not. And in her departure, there's this revelation that, as we were talking about the other day, this idea that there's a settled view in Britain that it's in trouble, and that this exposes that. And then there's a curious thing I have around her and this point that Paul Keating made. Did you see that Paul Keating comment around the extent to which we venerate a life of public service, even though we live in a society that values private interests and private capital and private reward? And there's always been a tradition in Western societies that we have, if you like, these safety valves in our society that make us feel okay about things that are structurally not. And I'm just interested to know what you think about that, whether or not she represents a history, even while the country is drifting the other way. She represents an idea of service or public good, even while the country drifts the other way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, certainly the history I was advocating is not history as analgesic, or history as kind of morphine, even worse. And so I think I don't want people to read Arthur Bryant. I want them to read, you know, both Andrew Roberts and Sathnam Tangera, you know, because they both matter a lot and they're both brilliant historians. And I think that the weird thing is, because we've stopped being history conscious, the shock of exactly what you say, James, is all the greater, which is, hang on, I thought we were basically okay. You know, in the 80s we were told, I think it's interesting, there's an interesting piece to be done on the Queen and Thatcher, actually, which is that Thatcher was the sort of ninja queen. You know, the Queen was the Queen and didn't say anything. Thatcher said, actually, we're brilliant. You know, I think Christopher Hitchens said, you know, she was the politician who would just not accept we're a second-rate nation. And it's a very good formulation, because you went from the 70s, where we appeared to be the sick man of Europe, the nation in decline, the nation that went to the IMF, and then all of a sudden, here came crazy Gloriana. Big Bang, Falklands, Scargill, Duran Duran, you name it, Bananarama, Mark. You know, it was just one thing after another. And I think the terrible, awful wrong turning in that decade was the confusion of market and society. That we were so excited by this thing called the free market, with good reason, because suddenly people were buying their own houses who'd never been able to buy their own house. There were more shareholders than union members for the first time. It's not nothing. Popular capitalism isn't something to be sneered at. However, it isn't the same as a society, and we've been recovering from that ever since. And in 1989, when the wall came down, we blew it, because there was a great opportunity to remake the world and this country. But we thought, bit of democracy, bit of liberal capitalism, everything will be fine. And it wasn't. And in 2009, the financial system collapsed, and we're still paying the price. Here endeth the intervention.
Yes, go for it.
Because I think I'm very conscious that actually now there are 3 white, middle to later middle-aged men commenting, but which is not representative of the nation anymore. But I think it is a very important point. And one of the phrases I'm using, we sing in the national anthem, "Reign over us." Actually, what I think the Queen symbolised was someone who reigned for us. And the question is, in our nation, who do we see as being for us? My fear is that we have become such a divided society that we only see people being for us if they agree with us or hold a particular view. Whereas the Queen spanned across that. And actually, if as a nation we don't pull together as for us together, then we probably are in trouble. And can Charles do that is one of the questions.
I'm not going to say anything as remotely intelligent as Matt to use the bishop, but I will volunteer myself as a non-white man. The only thing I was going to say, just riffing off what you've just said then, is when I did go to the palace, and I did go to the sort of Garden of Remembrance that's now growing up in Green Park, where they're finding any bush and any tree and stuffing a sort of bouquet of flowers in it and putting a teddy bear next to it. But what I was really struck by is the whole diversity of spectrum of nations that were gathered there. And if anything, overrepresented. And it was really interesting. So all ages and ranges, from tiny tots all through to older generation. But a lot of people from former Commonwealth countries, and my parents would be among them. They didn't go themselves, but they have a huge amount of respect for the Queen and the royal family. And I was really struck by what you said about, refugees and migrants coming over, and watching the footage over the weekend, some of the pieces, which obviously I'm sure the BBC have had in the can for a long time, but there was quite a few bits where I was, blubbing, frequently. But there was one piece where there was sort of Britain had given safe harbour to a particular group of refugees, not some of the more obvious ones. I can't remember, apologies, can't remember which country it was, but they were crying as they were recounting that when they finally got on the plane, there was a message that was played from the Queen saying, "You are coming to a safe country." And I'm going to get choked even talking about it, because I just thought it meant so much to them. And these are people who'd never set foot in Britain before, in the UK before. And the same with my family. I mean, they were crying when Edward abdicated, apparently. They felt such affinity with the royal family. So I think we lose that at our peril, and we sort of trivialise it at our peril. And, the fact that 750,000 people are expected to come and file past the coffin, that means something. That's not forced on them. No one's standing there saying, you will go and show your public respect. There clearly is a timelessness and a huge significance to potentially some of the mythology and the mysticism, but also the continuity. And actually, when we are feeling a little bit uncertain, and probably have done at different parts, over the decades. And actually we're seeing currently, I would argue, that what's going on with the current government and what has been going on over the last couple of years shows the danger of the short-termist thinking, and often when you are going after purely votes in a populist way, or potentially profitability sometimes with big business. Again, I would argue that sometimes having those counterbalances of something that you would think of as being quite archaic, and very entitled, the fact that they are able to take a long-term view for, again, arguably sometimes more altruistic reasons, is a helpful, well-rounded, contributing factor to our society. And I think a lot of people from around the world have felt very seen and cherished.
Thank you very much, Naomi. A ripple of polite applause is the tortoise equivalent of, Live Aid. I want to say a big thank you to everybody in the room. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I feel that, very grateful to people for being so honest. Some of these things are quite hard to talk about, but I think we've covered some ground. I'm noticing my senses. I've done a fair few thinkings. My sense is that people have spoken this evening with a greater degree of care than they do in other topics, which I think itself is interesting. The selection of the words, the phraseology, and the way that we've listened to one another, perhaps, has been different than in some other thinking. So thank you very much to that, and to everybody who's been watching online. There's been some interesting back and forth between Ian Campbell and Susie Kershaw, and we'll make sure that I read it properly, because I couldn't quite keep up with the chat because I was wanting to listen to everybody. Words that I've made a note of that people have said, I don't think any other thinking we've ever done would have had this particular combination of things: grace, soothing, gratitude, hopeful, David mentioned, which I think is an interesting feeling at this moment, halfway through the mourning period. Zav mentioned disorientation. We talked about connection. Matt's phrase of "we've lost the talent of thinking historically" really resonated with me. And I'm going to be reductive, but not least because the podcast series that Richard Lambert has made for us is very sumptuous. The sound design is very sumptuous. It's a sort of collection of artefacts organised in a beautiful narrative. And the experience of it, quite often when you listen to a podcast, I sort of find myself thinking about other things, and I'm making my sort of, you can't not listen to it. It's rather like when you go and look round a historic house and you have the sort of audio guide. It really transports you. That feeling of sort of being inside history and thinking in those terms, I think is it's great for that. I like Nico's comparison. I don't know how often the Queen's been compared to David Bowie or Gilbert and George. I'm sure it's what she would have wanted, but a living artwork is an interesting way of thinking about how this person who both feels so close and yet so distant to all of us has sort of left a mark on the world in those terms, I think is interesting. The Bishop, please, thank you, excuse me, said lots of interesting things, but I do think that distinction between reigning over and reigning for, and who is now King Charles reigning for, is something that is a great starting point for tomorrow's thinking, and I'm sure we'll fan out from there. So thank you very much to everybody for coming. I hope you have a safe and not too stressful journey home. It's not easy getting around London at the moment. So do come tomorrow to talk about Charles, and if you'd like to come on Thursday, we're going to talk about bereavement and how good we are at grieving, mourning, all of those associated things. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.